It was raining that morning, a soft, hesitant drizzle that blurred the edges of the city into something dreamlike and regretful. I had gone, as I sometimes did, when my mind refused the company of others, to St. Giles's, that narrow, echoing church whose nave seemed designed for private remorse. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp hymnals, and the silence of silence could have weight pressed upon me like an old coat I could not quite shrug off. I remember standing before the font, tracing the worn rim with my fingertips, when I caught the faintest glimpse of movement in the polished brass plate that hung beside the pulpit. A reflection, fleeting but definite, a figure slipping between pews, or perhaps just a shadow disturbed by passing clouds. But when I turned, the aisle was empty. The verger, a pale man of indeterminate age who regarded conversation as an affliction, appeared moments later. He told me, in the way one tells a story they've half forgotten, that a woman had been found dead there 2 nights earlier. Heart failure, he said, as though rehearsing the verdict. A widow, a regular visitor. Always came near closing, always sat alone in the back pew under the stained glass window of St. Michael. There was something in his tone that interested me, not grief, but an eagerness to be done with the subject. I asked if he recalled what she had been doing that evening. He hesitated, then said she had seemed troubled, that she'd lit a candle, but never knelt to pray. A curious omission, I thought. Even faith, when it falters, clings to ritual. Outside, the bells began to toll for noon, and I left the church reluctantly. Rain slid down the iron railings like liquid shadow. In the distance, I could see the spire of Magdalen faint through the mist, and beyond it the invisible pattern of lives that sooner or later would tangle themselves into mine. It was later that day, over a pint at the Randolph, that I unfolded a newspaper someone had left on the bar. The obituary column was modest, wedged between a notice for a piano recital and a small advertisement for genealogical services. Her name was Margaret Ellison. 62, a retired librarian, no family listed, died suddenly at St. Giles's Church. Funeral arrangements to be announced. A librarian? It was almost too fitting death amid silence and forgotten pages. I felt, though I could not say why, that the manner of her dying deserved a closer look. Not because I suspected foul play, at least not yet, but because something in the phrasing of her life, even in that brief summary, felt incomplete, like a crossword missing its final clue. I walked home beneath dripping eaves, my mind returning to that reflection in the brass. If one stares long enough at any polished surface, one begins to see not what is there, but what is missing. Perhaps it was merely my imagination, or perhaps imagination is simply the name we give to the part of the mind that still insists on meaning where others find none. That night, I took out the crossword from the Times and stared at a clue I had left unfinished earlier that morning, silent mourner found in reflection. 7, I smiled, though not without unease. The answer, when it came, felt like a quiet accusation spectre. I poured myself a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The rain has not stopped. It seldom does when one wishes it would. Somewhere beyond the darkened street, a bell chimed again, late, uncertain, as if unsure of its own purpose. I thought of Mrs. Ellison lighting her candle, of the reflection that wasn't mine, of the brass plate glimmering faintly like a mirror that refused the truth. There are moments in this profession when one senses the beginning of something faint and perilous, like a crack in a familiar wall. It begins not with a crime, but with a dissonance, a note out of place. And so it was, that night, as the whiskey burned its slow path downward, that I knew I would return to St. Giles, not out of duty, but curiosity. And perhaps something lonelier still. The letter arrived 3 days after Margaret Ellison's funeral, though I did not attend it. Funerals have always struck me as performances for the living rather than farewells for the dead, and besides, I doubted my presence would be welcome among those who preferred their mysteries left unexamined. It came folded neatly within college stationery, Christchurch, the seal faintly cracked, the ink beginning to fade where it had been pressed by an impatient hand. The dean's handwriting was delicate, almost tremulous, the sort of script one associates with men who still believe the shape of their words confers authority. He requested my informal counsel, as he put it, on a matter concerning the late Mrs. Ellison, who had, it appeared, been employed in a part-time capacity within the college library. The letter was polite, of course, but beneath its varnished civility there lingered something uneasy, an undertone of embarrassment, even fear. I walked there that same afternoon. The rain had lifted, but the air retained that washed metallic scent peculiar to Oxford after a storm like old coins rubbed between damp fingers. The quad lay quiet, the cobblestones slick with reflected sky, and as I crossed it I caught sight of a solitary figure in the window above the hall, the dean, waiting. He had always struck me as a man conscious of his own silhouette. He received me in his study with all the solemnity of a confession. Books lined the walls more decorative than read, and the air smelled faintly of brandy and polished wood. He offered tea. I declined. He began by speaking of Mrs. Ellison's tenure, 5 years of quiet, unremarkable service. A woman of intelligence and restraint, much admired by the fellows, though she kept to herself. It was only after her death, he continued, that certain irregularities had come to light. Missing volumes, restricted correspondence, a letter, most notably, addressed to him but never sent. Handed it to me then, folded once, sealed with a small cross of red wax already cracked. My name was not mentioned, but as I read, I felt her voice formal, precise, yet trembling beneath its own composure. She spoke of a discovery within the college archives, something she could not fully understand, something she feared might be suppressed. There were phrases I could not decipher. The ink had run where perhaps tears had fallen. One sentence, however, stood unblurred, written with an almost feverish insistence. The truth lies between the margins. The dean watched me as I read, his fingers fidgeting with the chain of his watch. He said he had found the letter in her locker 2 days before her death, tucked inside a volume of Donne's sermons. He had told no one else. I asked him why. He hesitated before admitting that the discovery involved certain historical donations to the college endowments, he said, that might not withstand scrutiny. He spoke as though the mere mention of impropriety could summon ruin from the rafters. When I asked whether Mrs. Ellison had confronted anyone about her findings, he shook his head too quickly. Perhaps not, he said, but there was someone of the senior fellows who had expressed strong disapproval of her cataloguing methods. The name he offered, Dr. Farnley, stirred a faint memory, a man of pedantic brilliance and icy self-regard, known for his intolerance of error and affection alike. As I left, I paused at the library entrance. The scent of old paper drifted out like a sigh. On impulse, I asked to see Mrs. Ellison's desk. The assistant, a nervous graduate with ink on his cuffs, led me to a small alcove by the window. There, among neatly stacked reference slips and sharpened pencils, lay an unfinished crossword from the Times. I recognized the pattern immediately, one of the more cryptic grids, the kind she must have enjoyed. Only one clue had been left incomplete. Hidden words preserve lost faith. 6. Later, in my room, I filled it in without effort. I folded the paper and placed it beside my glass. The phrase from her letter returned to me then, circling like a moth around an unseen flame. The truth lies between the margins. Not within, not beyond, but between. Perhaps she had meant the literal spaces, the annotated whispers in old books, where the living converse quietly with the dead. Or perhaps she had been speaking of something else entirely, those silences that exist between men and their institutions, between conscience and comfort. I poured myself another measure and sat listening to the city's evening bells. Somewhere, faint and untraceable, I thought I heard the echo of a turning page. It was the organ that drew me there. A faint, faltering hymn drifting through the afternoon rain, like something remembered rather than played. The chapel of St. Bernard stood hidden behind cloisters slick with moss, its door half open, as though unsure whether to invite or conceal. I had passed it many times before, but never entered. That day, curiosity overcame indifference, or perhaps loneliness did. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the weary perfume of extinguished candles. The pews glistened faintly where the rain had found its way through a cracked pane. A solitary figure sat near the altar, his head bowed not in prayer, but in thought. When he turned, I recognized him at once, Dr. Farnley. His face was, as I remembered, sharply lined with that perpetual look of irritation that only the intelligent can perfect. He greeted me with the politeness of a man who distrusts his own civility. Said he had been meaning to write. Said the Dean had no doubt mentioned my involvement. His words were measured, but beneath them I sensed a tremor, faint resentment, or perhaps fear that I might already know too much. I asked about Mrs. Ellison. A capable woman, he replied, but impertinent. She questioned classifications, handled texts beyond her clearance, made insinuations about discrepancies she did not understand, a dangerous combination, curiosity and half-knowledge. I let him speak. Scholars, like suspects, reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are explaining something trivial. As he talked, I noticed the missal beside him, open not to the expected liturgy but to a page of annotations of fine, neat script running along the margins. His hand rested upon it, possessive, almost tender. I remarked upon the handwriting. He said it was hers. She had been indexing the older theological texts before her death. He had not had the heart to erase her notations. Yet as he spoke I saw that some had already been crossed through, not in ink, but with a thumbnail pressed so hard the paper bruised. He rose to leave, but before he passed me, he paused. Said something curious then, that Mrs. Ellison had believed words could alter the truth of things, that she thought transcription itself a moral act. He smiled faintly, the smile of a man too certain of his own irony. She was mistaken, of course. The truth is never in the words. After he left, I remained seated. The chapel was empty but for the sound of rain and the slow drip of water from the eaves. On the lectern lay a small stack of hymn sheets, most blank on the reverse, save one, upon which someone had begun a crossword in pencil. I glanced down, unable to resist. Confession, misunderstood. Why, it was late afternoon when I first visited the small terraced house on Walton Street, the one Mrs. Ellison had left behind like a neatly folded note no one had thought to read. The widow who answered the door introduced herself as Mrs. Childs, a neighbour, and, as she said, with a slight tremor of pride, a friend of the deceased. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. There are some people whose sadness dries early and leaves only a kind of dull civility behind. She led me into a narrow sitting room that smelled faintly of rose soap and neglect. The curtains were drawn despite the light outside. She said she had taken it upon herself to tidy the place. Mrs. Ellison's brother had declined to come down from Yorkshire. Too many memories, apparently. I looked around. Everything was orderly, obsessively, so the armchair angled precisely toward the empty fireplace, a book open on a side table, a small vase of withered tulips. On the mantel stood a photograph of an older woman beside a younger man in uniform, both smiling in that restrained English way that never quite reached the eyes. Mrs. Childs told me the husband had died years ago, a minor academic, one of those quiet men who leave behind little but footnotes. She spoke as though rehearsing the lines she had offered to others. Already there was comfort, I think, in the repetition. But it was when I asked about the days before Margaret's death that her voice faltered. She said Margaret had seemed distant, distracted, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Spent long hours at the window upstairs, the one that faced the churchyard. Sometimes even at night. Once, Mrs. Childs had seen her reflected there, standing motionless, her candle trembling in the glass. I asked to see the room. The staircase creaked as we climbed. It was small, spare, but immaculately kept. Bookshelves on either wall, a narrow bed neatly made, and that window, the glass, old and slightly warped, bending the world outside into strange perspectives. The view was unremarkable from the upper branches of a yew tree, the roof of St. Giles's, and beyond it the faint shimmer of rain still clinging to the stones. There was a chair by the window. On it lay a small notebook, the kind librarians use for catalogue entries. Inside, neat handwriting filled every page, lists of titles, call numbers, cross-references. But toward the end, the entries grew erratic, interspersed with lines of verse Don, Herbert, even fragments of Latin I half recognized, and at the very bottom of the last page, beneath an incomplete quotation, she had written truth in reflection, but not in the thing itself. I stood by the window trying to see as she might have seen. My own face merged with the sky, a pale blur framed by rain-streaked glass. Below, the churchyard gleamed faintly. I noticed then the faintest mark on the window pane, a smudge at eye level, shaped like the curve of a fingertip. Not recent, but deliberate. She had touched the glass, not to clean it, but as if to test its substance. Mrs. Childs asked if I believed she had taken her own life. Her tone was tentative, almost pleading. I told her I didn't think so, though I wasn't sure. Death seldom announces its truth because it prefers suggestion to confession. As I left, she pressed a folded paper into my hand, said she had found it among the books and thought I should see it. Outside, beneath the dim street lamp, I unfolded it. It was a fragment torn from the Times literary supplement, and I had not intended to see him again. Yet there are certain men whose presence lingers even after the door has closed. Behind them, like the faint echo of a lecture one didn't wish to attend but cannot quite forget. Dr. Farnley had written, though he would never have called it a letter, 3 brief lines on college paper, unsigned, but unmistakably his, "If you wish to understand what she sought, come after chapel," alone. It was dusk when I returned to St. Bernard's. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobbles slick and reflective as mercury. The chapel door was ajar, as before, and I found him inside, not seated this time, but standing by the lectern, the great east window behind him awash with the final bruised light of evening. He began without a preamble, said he wished to clarify a few things for his conscience, or what remained of it. He had been her tutor once, long ago, when she was a mature student, already married, already certain that scholarship was less a profession than an illness. Their acquaintance had resumed when she returned to catalogue the archives. Too easily, he said, they had fallen into old rhythms of talk and trust. She had found letters between 2 former fellows, one of whom had later endowed the college. The nature of the correspondence, he implied, would have ruined more than reputations. He stopped then, as though waiting for my disapproval, but I said nothing. He went on, she had come to him, asking whether the letters should be made public. He had told her no. Not because of duty to the college, he was long past loyalty, but because he knew she would suffer for it. He said she'd grown restless after that, almost frantic, as though her discovery had released some secret longing of her own. As he spoke, I watched the dust drifting in the window's light, those small motes that seemed to fall upward, never downward. The silence between his words grew longer, heavier. Finally, he said that on the night she died, she had come again. They argued in the library after hours. He had left first. She was alive when he went. He repeated that twice, alive when I went, each word placed carefully, like stones across a stream one does not wish to cross. When I asked whether he believed she had taken her own life, his eyes flickered toward the window. The glass was old, uneven, distorting his reflection into something weary and uncertain. "I think," he said slowly, "that she wished to be seen, not saved." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that the letters were gone, vanished. He assumed she had hidden them, perhaps even sent them. He had searched, he admitted. That much, at least, was true. A gust of wind rattled the panes a single candle guttered beside him. I noticed the hymn book he'd left open on the lectern. There, beneath the printed lines, she had written again, in her fine, slanting hand, only through confession does the truth distort itself into grace. The ink was faint but unmistakable, her last marginalia. He followed my gaze, then closed the book sharply. I thought for a moment that he might weep. But men like Farn, I first saw her through the shimmer of reflected rain. She was standing in the doorway of the college workshop, a pale outline against the faint orange glow within. The plaque above the door read, "Conservator of Stained Glasser," humble title for a craft older and more exacting than most sciences. Her name was Clara Ellison, though she preferred to be called Miss Ellison. Margaret's daughter, as it turned out, though she offered that fact as one might confess an unremarkable sin. She was not beautiful, at least not in the way that draws notice, but there was something fragile about her composure, like a fragment of coloured glass that catches light when the rest lies dull. I told her I was making inquiries about her mother. She said she had expected me sooner. Her tone carried neither welcome nor reproach, merely inevitability. The workshop was a cathedral of dust and colour. Sheets of glass leaned against the walls in spectral hues, cobalt, amber, the faint green of oxidized copper. On the workbench lay a window panel from the chapel restoration, half cleaned, its saints reduced to outlines and soft glows of pigment. Clara worked here alone. She said the college had little budget for apprentices. She spoke of her mother sparingly, as though each word cost her something. They had been estranged for years, reconciled only recently, though even that word, reconciled, seemed too hopeful for what had passed between them. Margaret had written, asking to see her, but Clara had delayed the visit until it was too late. I asked whether she believed her mother's death to have been natural. She turned to the window and smiled faintly. "Nothing about my mother was natural," she said. There was a pause filled by the ticking of some distant pipe. I noticed then the small pieces of glass scattered on the floor, like frozen rain. A few bore etched inscriptions, names, dates, fragments of phrases. I stopped to examine one. Between the margins it read, "The letters backward," meant to be read through the pane. I asked about it. She said her mother had sent her those fragments years ago, as if testing her memory. They were pieces from broken chapel windows, part of a restoration Margaret had supervised once. Each shard, Clara said, had carried a line from a sermon or poem. Together they formed something unreadable, a collage of faith undone by its own excess. As she spoke, I saw a faint burn mark on her hand, near the wrist but deep. She caught my glance and covered it absently with her sleeve. I did not ask how it happened. Some truths insist on their own silence. On her workbench lay a small envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting. She noticed my eyes resting on it and, after a moment, handed it to me. Said she had read it many times, though it was not truly meant for her. Inside was a single page, thin and uneven from having been folded and refolded. The handwriting trembled near the end, where the ink thickened. If ever you see him, tell him the window was never broken, only misread. Clara asked if I understood what that meant. I said perhaps. In truth, I wasn't sure whether he referred to me or to Farnley or to someone else entirely, but the phrasing lingered misread, not shattered, not ruined, misread. Before leaving, I asked one last question, whether her mother had mentioned the missing letters, the correspondence that had caused such unease at the college. She hesitated, then said her mother had once spoken of words that outlived their purpose, letters that could neither be destroyed nor preserved without corruption. The truth, she said, was like light through flawed glass bent it one way, and even the saints appeared guilty. Outside the rain had stopped, the clouds had begun to thin, and in the puddles along the lane I saw the faint, wavering reflections of the college spires. I thought of the fragments on her floor, of how glass remembers the heat that shaped it. Perhaps people do too. Later that night, I took out my crossword. One clue had been troubling me all week. Transparence conceals meaning 7. The answer came quietly, almost without effort. I wrote it down and stared at the U, said it was the glass again that led me back. Not the stained, venerable panels of St. Bernard's Chapel, but a smaller piece of clear, ordinary, unremarkable, save for the faint scratches across its surface. I had found it on my desk that morning, delivered by hand, no note attached. When held to the light, I could just make out the faint outline of a single word, etched so finely it might have been invisible to anyone less accustomed to reading without forgiveness. Someone wanted me to look closer. That afternoon I walked once more through the quadrangle, where the stones still glistened from an earlier shower. The air was sharp, metallic, and the scent of wet leaves rose from the drains like memory. I paused beneath the archway where the college notice board stood, cluttered with lectures, recitals, and the occasional lost umbrella appeal. Among the fluttering papers was a new, additional type notice from the dean's office, announcing the forthcoming sale of redundant materials from the library restoration project. A tidy euphemism for quiet disposal. Inside, the library was unnaturally bright. The windows had been polished to a gleam so intense it turned the light almost hostile. I caught my own reflection in one of them, a man slightly stooped, greying at the edges, wearing an expression that might once have been mistaken for certainty. The assistant on duty, the same nervous graduate as before, told me that the glass fragments from the chapel were among the items marked for removal. He hesitated before adding that Miss Ellison had been in that morning to collect some of her mother's papers. She'd left, he thought, by the side door that opened onto the Fellows' garden. I found her there, kneeling beside a bench, sorting through a folder of yellowing documents. When she looked up, the wind caught her hair and scattered it across her face like thin threads of smoke. She seemed unsurprised to see me. I told her about the glass fragment, about the single word scratched into it. She said softly that her mother had a habit of leaving words in unexpected places, as though language itself were a kind of confession. I asked her if she believed her mother was capable of deception. She smiled faintly. "Everyone is," she said. "Even you." The reply stung more than it should have. There is a certain cruelty in honesty when spoken without malice. She showed me one of the letters from her mother's collection. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the voice was unmistakable. It spoke of the chapel window, showing the restoration had revealed not holy scenes but subtle alterations, saints repainted with new faces, inscriptions revised, dates recarved to align with college legend. Truth, she had written, is as fragile as glass, it cracks long before it breaks. The wind shifted, and the reflection of the chapel window shimmered across the surface of the page. I noticed something then, something small and absurdly human. The signature at the bottom of the letter, Margaret Ellison, had been written twice, one atop the other, as though she had doubted her own name. When I pointed it out, Clara said her mother had always been precise, almost painfully so. A double signature was unthinkable. She took the letter back, tracing the faint indentation beneath the ink. It was no duplication at all, but a carbon copy, the pressure of another sheet written beneath this one. A copy that had once existed and now did not. That was when I realized what had been troubling me from the start. The missing letters, the fragmented glass, the phrases repeated across margins. None of it had been lost by accident. She had been recreating something, a pattern of words and windows that mirrored each other. A confession, made not in writing, but in reflection. I asked Clara for the rest of the papers. She hesitated, then shook her head. Some truths, she said, are better left opaque. When she turned to leave, I saw the faint shimmer of the workshop's coloured glass, catching in her coat reds and blues, glancing off her like fragments of unassembled faith. I thought of her mother, standing at the window that last night, seeing not the churchyard, but her own face refracted through rain. Back in my room, I poured myself a drink and set the fragment on the desk beside me. In the lamplight, the etched word seemed to fade, then reappear, forgive. The crossword on the table lay unfinished, unclear evidence, misleading truth. 9. It took me longer than usual, the boy's voice cracked halfway through the hymn. I remember it more clearly than anything else from that evening, the sudden fracture in an otherwise faultless sound, a single note too human for its setting. The chapel was full, the organ swelling like a tide held barely in check, and yet that brief imperfection lingered long after the music ended. It was, I think now, the first true confession of the night. I had been invited by the dean, though invited is perhaps too generous a term. He'd asked me to attend evensong as a gesture of goodwill, an attempt to reassure the college that my inquiries were merely procedural. Oxford has a way of hiding its truths behind ceremony, as if incense and Latin could erase guilt. After the service, the boy was waiting outside the vestry, pale beneath the sodium lamps. He couldn't have been more than 12. His surplice hung too large on him, sleeves grazing the stone floor. He said he'd seen me before near the workshop, near the chapel, near places a boy shouldn't have noticed. His voice trembled when he spoke, and I could smell the faint sweetness of candle wax still clinging to his cuffs. He told me he had been in the chapel the night Mrs. Ellison died. Cleaning the brass, he said. He'd heard voices of 2 of them, low but urgent, a woman's and a man's. He thought it was the dean at first, but then he heard a sound like something falling. By the time he looked through the window, the place was empty. Only later did he learn of her death. I asked what he had seen precisely. He hesitated, then said he thought the window had broken and that he'd seen light scatter across the floor like water. But when he returned the next morning, there was no damage, no trace at all. He thought he'd imagined it. Children are often accused of mistaking truth for imagination, simply because it doesn't fit the adult version of events. When I pressed him for more, he faltered, said the dean had told him not to repeat it, that it was a misunderstanding of reflections. It was that phrase that fixed itself in my mind, reflections. Again and again the word had surfaced on glass, in letters, in the quiet turns of speech that avoided the direct. The boy began to cry then, not loudly, but in the way one does when one realizes too late that honesty brings punishment, not relief. I gave him my handkerchief, the same one I'd folded away after Mrs. Ellison's funeral. He took it wordlessly and said he hadn't meant to lie. He only wanted to sing well. That's all he'd ever wanted. I walked him to the gate, where his mother awaited a tired woman whose gratitude was as wary as her gaze. When they left, the fog had begun to rise from the river, softening the lamps into orbs of pale fire. Back in my room, I wrote down what he'd said, though I already knew the truth of it lay elsewhere, not in what he had heard, but in what he had seen and could not name. A reflection mistaken for breaking glass, a body that fell not forward but backward, the light refracted through old lead and flawed panes. It came to me then the meaning of a line from one of Margaret's old notes I'd half dismissed before truth, like light, is bent by its passage through belief. The choir boy had not erred in what he saw, only in how he named it. The window had not shattered. It had been revealed. I poured myself a drink and watched the city lights shimmer against the rain-darkened glass. For a moment, my own reflection appeared doubled, two faces, slightly misaligned, one older, one unguarded, and I thought of the boy's cracked note, the sound that had cut through the evening like a blade of air. It was not a mistake at all, it was the truth, heard too early. It was the dean who summoned me that morning. His note, brief to the point of discourtesy, asked for my presence in the vestry to clarify certain matters before the service. I took that to mean before the whispers grew louder than the sermon. The chapel was nearly empty when I arrived. The organist was rehearsing a hymn in slow, fragmented bars as though testing whether sound itself could still believe in structure. The dean stood beside the pulpit holding a stack of papers that looked, even from a distance, too pale to be innocent. He began speaking before I had reached him. There had been an incident, he said. The sermon scheduled for that morning had gone missing. In its place, someone had left a rewritten version, neatly typed, same text, same layout, but with subtle alterations, one paragraph, perhaps two, to say what should not have been said. He passed me both copies. At first glance, they were identical, the same sermon on forgiveness and truth, the same predictable rhythm of theological platitudes. But then I noticed it. A single line moved from the end of one paragraph to the beginning of another, like a mislaid thought, struggling to return to its rightful place. It changed everything. The original read, "The burden of truth must be borne in silence." The altered version, "The burden of silence must be borne in truth." It was the kind of inversion that could undo a reputation. Quietly, devastatingly, the dean's hands trembled as he explained that only 3 people had access to his drafts: the secretary, the chaplain, and, until recently, Mrs. Ellison. She had assisted with the archive digitization and had often typed his sermons for preservation. It seemed she had preserved more than he intended. He insisted the matter remain private for the dignity of the college. Yet dignity is a fragile substance, easily cracked by reflection. I told him I would look into it. He said something about discretion. I nodded and left before his fear could turn to appeal. Outside, the bells began their measured complaint against the morning air. I walked across the quad the 2 sermons folded inside my coat. The clouds were low, the colour of tarnished silver. Every sound felt amplified by the shuffle of robes, the click of heels, the faint rustle of paper, as a verger adjusted the hymn numbers. In my rooms later I compared the texts line by line. It wasn't only that one phrase. Several smaller alterations appeared minor at first, then deliberate. An omitted comma, a substituted adjective, a biblical citation corrected with scholarly precision, the work of someone meticulous, someone who understood both theology and subtext. One sentence stood out: "We must look through glass darkly, yet with enough light to see our own deceit reflected back." It hadn't been in the original draft at all. I remembered it then from the marginalia in Mrs. Ellison's notebooks, copied in her careful hand. She had rewritten his sermon before her death. But why? That evening I returned to the chapel. The light had faded, the windows glowed faintly from within, their colours subdued to a quiet pulse. On the lectern, the dean's original sermon lay ready for the morning. The rewritten version had vanished. A figure moved in the shadows near the aisle. It was the chaplain, a mild man, his kindness worn thin by routine. He said he had come to tidy the hymnals, though his tone suggested otherwise. When I asked whether he'd seen the altered sermon, he paused. Then, almost absently, he said he had destroyed it, for the sake of peace. He looked past me then toward the crucifix, and added that Mrs. Ellison had often spoken of sermons as mirrors that each listener heard only their own reflection. He'd told her that faith was not a matter of reflection, but of obedience. She had smiled, he said, and replied that obedience without reflection was merely repetition. When he left, the air in the chapel seemed heavier, as if thought itself were lingering. I stood before the pulpit and glanced upward at the great east window. The saints were almost invisible in the dimness, their faces shadowed by fractured light. And in that darkness I saw again her phrase, "The truth lies between the margins." I realized then what the rewritten sermon was not defiance, but a translation, a final act of correction. She had taken his words and turned them back toward meaning. As I left, I caught sight of a single page on the pew beneath the pulpitone that must have slipped unseen. It bore only a single line, underlined twice in red. Even the faithful misquoted themselves. I folded it carefully into my pocket. Outside, the rain began again, soft and insistent, washing the city clean of sound. It was the sound that woke me, a sharp, crystalline report that split the early morning stillness. For a moment I thought it was thunder, but Oxford knows its own silences, and this one was different. I rose, half-dressed, and crossed to the window. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the air thin and pale. Down in the quadrangle, a small knot of figures had gathered near the chapel doors. Even at that distance I could see the flash of glass on stone. By the time I reached the courtyard, the verger was already sweeping. He said a window had shattered one of the restored panels above the chancel. No sign of entry, no sign of vandalism, just a sudden fracture, as if the glass had given up holding itself together. Inside, the smell of dust and incense mingled like breath and memory. The east window, the great centerpiece of the chapel, stood fractured but not destroyed. Only one section had fallen, a small figure of St. Michael, his face reduced to shards that caught the weak light like a handful of tears. The dean arrived soon after, visibly shaken. He muttered something about structural fatigue, about age and temperature. I nodded, though I knew better. Glass, like conscience, breaks not from pressure, but from imbalance, from one side bearing more truth than the other. As he fussed over the verger's progress, I noticed something lodged in the ledge beneath the broken section. A sliver of paper folded tightly, half caught in a web of lead. I asked for the ladder and climbed carefully, ignoring the dean's protest. The paper came free with little effort. A page, torn from a sermon, draft-typed, corrected in longhand. I knew the script instantly, Margaret Ellison's. The dean pretended to be surprised when I showed it to him, but his voice betrayed the effort. He asked how it could have gotten there, whether perhaps it had been dislodged during restoration. Possible, yes. Probably no. Later, in my room, I unfolded the page and read it slowly. The words were from a sermon I had seen before her revision of the dean's. But there was a new line added at the end in darker ink. To confess is not to repair, but to release the fracture into light. It was not theology, it was an explanation. That afternoon I went to the workshop one final time. The place was empty now, the smell of varnish faint, the benches cleared. Only a single pane remained propped against the wall, a test piece, unfinished, depicting nothing recognizable. I ran a finger along its edge. It was smooth, almost too smooth. A faint inscription ran along the base, invisible until the light caught it at an angle. Truth refracted is still truth. I thought of Clara then, of the precision with which she had handled her tools, the careful restraint of her voice. She had not come to the funeral, nor to the service that followed. I had asked once whether she believed her mother's death was accidental. She'd said she didn't think accidents existed, only consequences misunderstood. Outside, the bell began to toll for evening prayers. I walked toward the chapel, where the broken glass had been gathered into a wooden crate. The verger had set it aside by the altar, waiting for instruction. The pieces caught the candlelight like frozen flame. I knelt beside them, almost without knowing why, and saw in their fractured surfaces the suggestion of a face, not divine, not saintly, but human. There was a finality to that silence, the kind that follows not revelation but recognition. I took one of the fragments and held it up to the window. The light passed through it muted, imperfect, and achingly alive. That night, back in my room, I finished the crossword. Only one clue remained unanswered, one that had lingered for days. Broken truth, seen clearly at last. 10. I stared at it for a long time, the whiskey untouched beside me. Then, almost reluctantly, I wrote the answer, shattering. I set down my pen and closed the paper. Through the rain-streaked window, the lights of the city flickered faintly blurred, divided, yet somehow whole. Perhaps that was what she had meant all along, that the truth, once broken, is not lost, but scattered, waiting for someone patient enough to piece it together again, knowing it will never quite fit. And perhaps, I thought, that is all forgiveness ever is. There are mornings when Oxford feels too quiet, as though the city itself is pausing to recall something half forgotten. That was one of them. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, and the pavements were slick with the residue of night. From my window I could see the spire of St. Bernard's, its reflection trembling faintly in a puddle that had gathered beneath the gate. The investigation, if one could still call it that, was over. Reports filed, statements signed, the college suitably relieved of its conscience. And yet I could not bring myself to believe in endings. Oxford does not end things, it absorbs them, the way stone absorbs footsteps. I walked to the chapel one last time. The air inside was cold, though the sun had begun to burn through the clouds, spilling across the nave in long, reluctant shafts. The broken window had been repaired, painstakingly, reverently, but even from the doorway I could see the difference. The new glass was too perfect. It lacked the faint irregularities that once caught the light like hesitation. The verger was polishing brass near the altar. He nodded without surprise when he saw me. said the restoration had been completed ahead of schedule, said Miss Ellison had overseen it herself. I asked how she seemed. He paused, as though searching for a word precise enough to hold ambiguity. "Tired," he said finally. The kind of tiredness that lingers even after resting. I stayed long after he had gone. The chapel was silent, but not still. Dust floated in the air, soft and golden. Through the repaired window, the sunlight scattered across the floor in fractured patterns, and for a moment I thought I could see her reflecting the faint outline of Margaret Ellison standing once more where she had fallen. But it was only the play of light, or perhaps light playing memory. There was a folded leaflet on one of the pews, the morning's order of service. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "The truth endures only in its retelling." I turned it over, half expecting to see her handwriting, but it was anonymous. Perhaps the chaplain's, perhaps mine, forgotten. I thought then of the crossword waiting on my desk. The final clue is unfinished. It had been haunting me for days. Resolution seen through clarity 5. The answer had eluded me until that moment. I smiled, though without much pleasure. Glass. When I stepped outside, the bells began to ring for noon. Their sound rolled over the rooftops, echoing faintly in the wet air. Students crossed the quad with books pressed to their chests, and a bicycle wheel splashed through a puddle, sending ripples through a reflection that had almost steadied. At the corner of the lane stood Clara Ellison. She was looking up at the window, her face unreadable. When she saw me, she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than greeting. I asked if she was leaving. She said there was work waiting in Durham, another restoration, another set of windows too long neglected. She added, after a pause, that her mother would have liked the repair, not for its perfection, but for its effort. We spoke little after that. Some silences, I've learned, are not empty, but exactly too finely balanced to disturb. When she turned to go, the sunlight caught her hair, and for an instant the colour was the same as the glass she worked with, translucent, fragile, enduring. I watched until she disappeared down the high, swallowed by the city's endless curve. Then I walked the long way home, past the river, where the afternoon light moved across the water like thought across an old wound. Back in my room, I poured the last of the whiskey and sat by the window. The city was quiet again. Somewhere, a bell struck one. I looked down at the crossword and filled in the final word. The grid was complete, yet the pattern seemed unfinished, as if meaning, once glimpsed, could never quite be held. I closed the paper and turned toward the glass. The light was fading now, but for a few moments it lingered on the pane, a dull gleam, fractured and whole, shifting with the breath of the evening air. And in that fragile reflection, I saw not the city, nor the chapel, nor even her face. Only the faint suggestion of something passing through, unchanged by its passage. It was then I understood, perhaps too late, what all of it had meant. The truth had never been hidden. It had only been waiting like light through the window for someone patient enough to notice how it moved,